After my grandparents left me $26 million, my parents tried to force me to hand it over. What followed was grief, legal battles, a child's illness, and the slow, stubborn work of choosing boundaries over blood. The funeral flowers still smelled like overripe pears in the conference room at Kelsey and Dunn. The receptionist had tried to find a vase big enough for the lilies, but they were folded into a pitcher like limbs, and it made the whole place feel like a wake, not a law office. I sat at the end of the glossy table with Avery pressed into my side, her thumb in her mouth, the other hand rubbing the worn ear of her stuffed rabbit. Our grandparents loved their drama, my brother Kyle said, but he was smiling the way you smile when you're shaking. My parents sat across from me. My father's jaw was set, my mother's mouth smoothed into what she probably thought was dignity. Mr. Dunn read through papers with a slow, careful voice. Terms, dates, the name of the trust. And then he said it out loud, like a challenge thrown into the ring. $26 million, he said. The air made a soft sound, like the room inhaled. I felt the grain of the table under my fingertips, tiny silk snag lines from years of elbows. I looked down, because looking anywhere else felt like stepping in traffic. Mr. Dunn slid the letter toward me, the one with my name in my grandmother's looping script. For Claire, it said at the top. Use it to change something and to get free. He kept reading, the clauses sliding over each other. Beneficiary, pour over, successor trustee. My father turned to me as if there were no one else in the room. Obviously, we will handle the bulk of it, he said. To make sure it's done right. I felt the crease of the envelope dig into my palm. I could hear Avery whispering to her rabbit, her voice a whispery lint. I looked up at my parents and saw, for the first time, not grief but hunger. No, I said. It's mine. I said it quietly. But it was like shoving a match to a line of gasoline. Everything that followed was just the light finding its way. When I was small, my grandparents' house smelled like lemon oil and sugar cookies, and the rugs had a way of trapping afternoon sun, like the light was stitched into the fringe. They lived on Hargrove Street, near the old cotton mill in Briarwood, Ohio, mid-sized and proud of it, a place with a decent hospital and a high school football team that could fill a Friday night to the rafters. Frank and Lillian Morgan were not fanciful. They were people who liked a clean porch and a tamped-down front lawn. They made money by accident. My grandfather founded a small logistics company after a layoff, then sold it to an international firm right before retirement, a timing game he always refused to call lucky. We were paying attention, he would say, tapping his temple with his coffee spoon. That's half of it. My parents were different kinds of people. My father hustled like a man treading water, charming and always one invoice away from a new idea. He tried landscaping, then a small pool cleaning business, then flipping a string of foreclosures on the south side that never quite flipped. My mother ironed shirts in the still-hot kitchen and pretended spreadsheets were the same thing as plans. They made a family the way you make a stew out of whatever you have. Sometimes it came out, sometimes it tasted like the inside of a penny. When I was 9, my father had an argument with my grandfather about a loan that wasn't technically a loan. The voices rose in that quiet Morgan house like the wind through a slit in a door. My mother called me and Kyle into the car and didn't turn off the radio the entire drive home. She kept saying, "You have to understand your grandfather," as if she were translating a language none of us spoke. At my grandparents' table, though, the world was predictable. My grandmother set out 2 kinds of jam and asked me which tasted most like June. My grandfather showed me how to sign my name like I meant it. He hit the speed bump at just the right angle on the way to the library, so that my stomach lifted like a bird hopping once and then settling again. They showed up for every school concert, the paper pumpkins taped to windows, the muddy soccer games that ended in ties and Capri Sun pouches crushed into the earth like buried treasure. They were there when my father bought a truck he couldn't afford, when the pool cleaning business collapsed, when my parents pawned their wedding rings for a week and then bought them back with a story we all agreed to call temporary. When I got pregnant at 25, my grandparents didn't flinch. "We'll paint the crib," my grandfather said, and he did, steady hands, white lacquer. Avery was born with a full head of dark hair and a cry that sounded like a question. She remade me in a day. I cried at TV commercials after that, the ones with fathers braiding their daughters' hair, the ones with dogs. Noah, her father, and I try to be something we weren't. We lasted 3 years and called it with a hug in the parking lot of Jefferson Elementary. He moved to an apartment nearby and never stopped showing up for Avery, even when we could barely look at each other without seeing the ways we had failed. By the time my grandparents' health started to turn, I had moved back into their home to help. Lillian's hands shook when she tried to thread needles. Frank's back hurt when he stood too long. They grew slower and then all at once, as if the year itself had joined in. It felt like people sometimes do when they get old, smaller in their own clothes. We started spending afternoons at Briarwood Regional Medical Center, in the clean, bright corridors that smelled like antiseptic and hope. The nurses knew my grandparents by name. They'd say, "Frank, I swear you bring the sunshine with you," and he'd answer, "It's just the bald head," and they'd laugh. My mother showed up sometimes. She sat on chairs like she was visiting someone in the lobby of a hotel. My father brought flowers that were too large for the vases. He talked too loud. He told the nurses about his newest idea, an app that would connect people who had to move suddenly with people who owned trucks. When the app never launched, he talked about a specialty coffee cart. He was always finding the next shore. The winter they both left, it felt like the town turned gray to match them. I held Lillian's hand in the hospice unit while she stared at the tree branches outside the window like they were telling her a secret. Frank went 2 weeks later, like he couldn't stand to be in a world without her. The mortician asked me what music they liked, and I couldn't say "Silence, that feels like company," so I said Ella Fitzgerald, and it was close enough. The funeral brought a parade of people who loved them. The banquet room at Dell's had too much seating and not enough chairs, just the way my grandmother would have liked it. People stood and told stories about how Frank helped them find a job after the factory closed, about how Lillian let them sleep in the guest room when the locks were changed, about casseroles and lawn mowers and rides to the cancer center in Columbus when Briarwood Regional couldn't do more. I expected the reading of the will to be a formality, some measured thing like a metronome. What I didn't expect was for my parents to sit across from me and calculate my grief in dollars. When Mr. Dunn said $26 million, a number so close to obscene that it didn't feel like something I could own, I felt a vibration through the room like a tuning fork. I didn't say yes or no to the money, I just breathed. I held Avery a little closer without meaning to, and she pressed her face into my sweater. "Obviously," my father said, his eyes on me like headlights, "we'll handle the bulk of it." "No," I told him, the word like a pebble in my mouth, small and hard and making what it could. And when I realized what I had said, what I had chosen, it was already too late to take it back. The calls started that night. They came in neat blocks, like he was making a schedule and sending alarm reminders, except the reminders were me. "We're your parents," my mother said. "We should manage it together," she said. "You need guidance, Claire." My father said, "You think you know everything and you're being ungrateful, and your grandparents were old. It's not like they knew what to do with that kind of money." I told them I needed time. "What do you even need time for?" my mother asked. "It's just numbers and an account. We'll make sure it grows." I stared at the ceiling at night, and the ceiling stared back with its cheap white paint and the 2 little cracks that looked like parentheses. Avery slept with her foot pressed to my thigh, like she was anchoring both of us. On the nights Noah had her, I listened to the refrigerator hum, the neighborhood dogs bark, the occasional car sigh by. It felt like being alone on a dock, the water black, the boats creaking like they might get up and walk. The texts came the next day, and they used a tone I recognized from my childhood, reasonable until it wasn't. "My father, we can pay off our mortgage and free up cash. Then we can invest in those rental properties on Harper Street." "My mother, your father talked to a guy about a coin-op laundry. Passive income. It'll be yours when we're gone too. Think big, honey." When I didn't answer, they escalated in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the dance we had danced for years. My mother texted, "If it weren't for us, you wouldn't even be here." "My father, we put food in your mouth. Don't you think we deserve a little respect?" The paradox of money is that it makes everything into money. Grief became a ledger. Memories became bargaining chips. Love became a weight used to press my hand on a pen. They burned through the easy asks quickly. "We just need the down payment," my father said. The bank will do the rest. Can you co-sign? My mother asked. Just to get the interest rate down. You'll thank us someday, my father said, his voice warm and false, the way it gets when he thinks he has you. I said I would think about it because it bought me 24 hours. I knew all the language that buys time. It's the language of people who learn to fold themselves first so they wouldn't get broken. When I didn't move fast enough, my mother called me at work. I was cataloging a box of picture books at Jefferson Elementary, the kind that smell like paste and soft paper, the kind that end in reassurance. I'm worried your grandparents made a mistake, she said. They were old. They were grieving their entire life. That isn't a mistake, I said. A life. Well, she said, and I could hear her shift into the voice she used when salespeople called at dinner. That's one way to look at it. My father started showing up. I'd come out of the grocery store, and he'd be leaning against his truck like a coincidence. He'd see me at the Apple Butter Festival and carry Avery on his shoulders like he'd always been that kind of grandfather. He discovered social media and made a vague post about people who think they're better than their family, and the town humored him, because that's what the town does when people behave badly in public. When I said no to co-signing on the laundromat, my father was silent for a long moment on the phone. I guess you think you're some big shot now, he said finally. No, I said. I think I'm trying to do what they asked me to do. And what on earth would that be? He asked. Make something that outlasts, I said. It wasn't exactly what my grandmother had written in her letter, use it to change something and to get free, but it was the shape of it. My mother chimed in on speaker as if they were a unit that thought the same thought. You're being dramatic, she said. We're not asking for 26 million. We're asking for a chance. We're your family. My heart rolled over in my chest. I know, I said. But no. I hung up and cried in the school parking lot, the late afternoon sun making everything gold and unforgiving. Mrs. Chin, the principal, tapped my window after a while and handed me a tissue. Do you know the breathing square? She asked. 4 counts in, hold for 4, out for 8. I laughed even as I was crying. I teach it to the kids, I said. I forget it exists for me. Isn't that always the way, she said, and patted the car like it was a living thing that could carry both of us. I tried to put my head down and ignore it. I took Avery to the apple orchard on the edge of town, and we fed goats with square teeth that tickled our palms. I set up a meeting with Mr. Dunn to talk through the binding technicalities of the trust, and found myself drawing a box around the number 26, like a kid writing bubble letters. It didn't feel like mine. It felt like a number someone else had left in my purse by accident. Noah and I sat on my grandmother's old sofa, the one with the pink roses worked into fabric so thick it resisted stains. You don't owe them, he said, gently, like he knew where the bruises were. You owe Avery. You owe you. They're my parents, I said. It felt like turning a knife that had already cut something. I don't want to be cruel. The thing about boundaries, he said, is they're not cruel. They're just borders. Without them, everything swims together. He was right. It didn't make it easier to sleep. The first time they crossed a line, it didn't look like violence. It looked like finding my mother's car parked outside Avery's school 15 minutes before dismissal, my mother fiddling with her phone like she had just happened to be there. Thought I'd surprise her, she said, bright as if she were starting a party. Take her for ice cream. You can't do that, I said. You need to check with me. Since when? She asked. Claire, she's my granddaughter. I used to watch you when you were her age. Your mother didn't micromanage. She was at work, I said. I was shaking. It was a familiar heat, the kind that starts at the throat and pushes outward. You need to ask. You can't just take her. But I didn't, she said, gesturing to the school. She's still inside. That's not the point, I said, and heard how impossible I sounded to her, how contrary and ungrateful. To her mind, a grandchild was an extension of her hand. She left with her lips tight. In the rearview mirror, I watched her text ferociously. A week later, Avery woke with bruises on her legs that weren't in the usual places you'd expect on a 7-year-old. Small ones, like thumbprints left by air. She'd been tired for weeks, chalked up to growth spurts and a new school year and the kind of summer that swallows bedtimes. Noah and I brought her to Briarwood Regional, that bright-smelling place that had seen me dragging my grandparents through its doors and was now seeing me carry my daughter. The ER doctor had eyes that made you feel like a person, not a problem to solve. He ordered blood tests and said not to worry until it was time to worry. He gave Avery a popsicle that stained her mouth red. The results sent us to Columbus, to Nationwide Children's, to the oncology floor where the air tasted too clean and the walls were a cheerful shade of teal that felt like a dare. The word leukemia appeared like a bruise in our vocabulary, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common kind in kids. Treatable. A plan that stretched 2 years like a road. I learned words like ANC and port and methotrexate. I learned the rhythm of infusion days, packing a bag with stickers and a thin blanket that smelled like home. Avery watched movies with headphones and a serious face, sucking on lemon drops like she had a job to do. My parents found out 2 days after the diagnosis because I sent a message that said, simply, "We're at Nationwide. Avery's sick." I didn't want to hoard the truth, even if I wanted to hoard everything else. They arrived with flowers too big for the corner of the room, as always. My father cried, crude and wet, and I held his shoulder because I am not made of ice. My mother clucked over Avery's socks and adjusted her blanket and asked what the doctors thought, like she hadn't been told the plan twice already. "We'll help," my mother said. "We'll be there for the treatments. We'll take her on off days. We'll manage the money piece. It's too much for you." "We're okay," I said. "We have it." My father looked around the room like it belonged to him. "We saw the pictures of the house," he said, meaning the one my grandparents had left to me. "It needs work. You should sell and move out near the hospital. We can help make that happen." "Please stop," I said. "Please just be here for her. Don't tell me what to do," my mother said, and I saw the tension slip over her face like a mask. "We're trying to help you. Your father and I have experience with this kind of thing." "With what?" I asked. "With cancer. With finances," she snapped. "With logistics. With life. Maybe if Avery hadn't been there with the 4 in her arm, I could have managed it. But she was, and I couldn't." "You can sit," I said. "You can bring books and sit. Or you can leave. Those are the choices right now." My father's jaw worked like he was biting something. "You'll regret this," he said. That night, at 2 in the morning, my doorbell rang. I went to the peephole and saw my father on the porch, shoulders heaving, phone in his hand like a weapon he'd forgotten he was holding. "Open up," he shouted, voice cramped by the porch ceiling. "I swear I'll stand here all night." Avery woke up with a dry little cry, stumbling down the hall like a night-blind deer. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "Back to bed." But she stood there watching me, small and too wise, while my father pounded the door again. I imagined the neighbors' lights clicking on one by one like dominoes. I imagined the police. I imagined my daughter's heart galloping like a terrified animal. I called Noah and he arrived in 10 minutes like a siren. He separated my father from the door with hands that were firm but not hurting, and I stood in the entryway shaking. When my mother showed up 5 minutes later, she started crying, not because she was worried about the neighbors, not because she was ashamed, but because she thought we were being unkind to her. It was so small. It was the smallest thing I could never forgive. By morning, I had made a decision I had been trying to outrun since the moment Mr. Dunn said the number at the table. There is a kind of breaking that feels like shaking glass, a sound the world makes before it splits. That morning, I called Mr. Dunn and asked for a referral to someone who did more than estate planning. He gave me the number for Sarah Patel, a lawyer whose name I knew from the one-line article in the Briarwood Gazette last year about a protective order and a custody case that made the entire town put its hand over its mouth. Sarah met me at her office with a paper cup of tea and a manner that was so calm it felt like a place to set something down. She had a plant she clearly watered on schedule and a window that looked out onto the parking lot of the pediatric practice next door. "Walk me through everything," she said. "Start when it started to feel like too much." I told her about the money, the calls, the flower arrangements that never fit, the doorbell at 2 in the morning while my daughter, who now had a Metaport in her chest and a battery of calendar dates that ran the next 2 years like beads on a string, stood watching. She asked for dates, details, anything backed up by something that wasn't my word. Receipts, if there were any. I knew this game. I emptied my bag onto her desk, fingers shaking. I had printed screenshots the way you print a boarding pass you don't trust your phone to keep. My father's text at 10:41 p.m. that said if you loved us, you'd share. My mother's at 7:13 a.m. that said you are making a dangerous mistake. A copy of the letter my grandparents wrote, the one that began with my name and the directive to change something and free myself, and then went on for 3 pages about scholarships and the library on Hargrove Street and the difference between helping and enabling. Good, she said, tapping each piece until it made a neat stack. We start with the basics. A no-contact letter. Then, if they escalate, we consider a civil protection order. We keep a log. We don't engage in emotional brawls. We keep to the facts. She looked up. Do you have a sense for why they were left out of the trust? I felt the world pulse. It's not that they were left out. That was it. It wasn't disinheritance. It was a single beneficiary. Those are 2 ways to think about the same thing, she said, soft, not unkind. It matters because if they try to contest the will or the trust, and they probably will, the court will look at capacity and influence. We will point to a long history of your grandparents' financial sense and a long history of your parents asking. There was a letter, I said, and pulled it out of the folder like it could burn through the table. She read it, eyes moving across the loops of my grandmother's hand, her brow softening. The letter said my name in a way that was not a chain. It said, Dear Claire, we did this with clear heads. Your parents will be angry. They may say you owe them. You do not. If you can, build something that bears your name and our names. If you cannot, make a smaller thing and call it enough. There was another page with numbers, times my grandparents had bailed my parents out. $10,000 for the pool business that never launched. $6,000 for a down payment that was somehow spent on appliances, and then the house fell through. 4 times my father had asked for money to get over a hump, and 4 times my grandparents had written a check with a hand that trembled a little, not with age but restraint. I can show you bank statements, Sarah said. We'll get them officially through discovery if we need to. We'll paint a picture. Not of bad people. Of people who ask and people who chose not to give again. I don't want to ruin them, I said, and part of me meant it. The other part knew that ruin is something people do to themselves and then try to pin to anyone close by. Keep your goal in mind, Sarah said. What is your line in the sand? My daughter doesn't deserve to live in a house that feels like a siege, I said. I want quiet. We can fight for that, she said. We sent the letter. It was dry and unruffled, a polite no thrown into a locked drawer. It said, Do not contact my client by phone, text, or in person. All communications should go through this office. It said, There have been no loans. There will be no loans. It said, Please do not attempt to pick up your granddaughter without prior written permission. My parents got it the next day, and my father called me 3 times in a row like he could call through a letter. I didn't pick up. He texted, Your little lawyer thinks she can scare us with big words? My mother texted, This is disgusting, Claire. You don't treat family like criminals. I took screenshots and put them in the folder. I made copies of the copies. I kept the folder on my kitchen counter, as if it were a cookbook for a meal I needed to keep cooking. When I went to Columbus with Avery and Noah, the folder came with me, sliding into the tote with the lemon drops and the blanket and the portable DVD player that whined when the disc spun up. I knew my parents. I knew their rhythm. Silence meant they were recalibrating, not retreating. I took Avery to get a wig the color of her own hair, and she threw up on my shoes in the clinic bathroom. I held her hand and she said, It tastes like a penny, and I said, Me too, because honesty felt like the only way to be with her now. A week passed. 2. I took a deep breath and measured a square. And then my mother pulled the only lever she thought would move me. She called Mr. Dunn and asked for a family meeting. She said the words mediation and solution and compromise. She said she wanted to understand. She said, We tossed and turned all night. What if we did something wrong with your inheritance? As if she had been the one to hold the checkbook, as if she were the one who weighed the difference between help and harm. Mr. Dunn is a very polite man. He called me and asked if I was open to it. You'll be there, I said, and he said he would. And my lawyer, I said, and he said, of course. I imagined my parents in their Sunday clothes, my mother wearing pearls she'd gotten at a flea market, my father in a blazer that still had the plastic sewn into the vents. I imagined them trying for the shape of respectability they had always been sure would open doors. Okay, I said. We'll meet. The conference room had been rearranged, the lilies replaced with a low bowl of chrysanthemums, as if the flowers could signal a reset. Mr. Dunn sat at the head of the table. Sarah to my right. Noah had Avery at home with Lego built into a city that sprawled across the living room rug. My parents came in together and took their seats. My mother wore the pearls. My father's blazer did, in fact, still have the plastic sewn into the vents. Thank you for coming, Mr. Dunn said. He was the kind of man who said that even to people who had thrown his paralegal into an apoplexy with daily calls and sighing. My mother folded her hands, the picture of a person who had never raised her voice on a porch at 2 a.m. We want to make this right, she said. My father looked at Sarah and didn't try to hide his disdain. We didn't need lawyers in this family, he said. We used to talk. I breathed in and out. I will be here if they could be here, I told myself, an odd sentence that made sense only to me. We're here to talk about expectations, Sarah said. And about the letter my client sent. And perhaps about the letter from Frank and Lillian that we plan to enter into the record if necessary. My mother blinked, something like panic moving under the thin, dry film of composure. Record, she said, tasting the word and not liking it. You make this sound criminal. No, Sarah said. Boundaries are much less exciting than crime. My father turned to me. Claire, he said, you are being led down a path by people who do not care about our family. Your path is a cliff, I said, the words out before I could sand their edges down. I have a daughter with leukemia. I have 2 years of treatment ahead. I have a spreadsheet of medications and your texts. I have a folder of the times you asked my grandparents and they said yes. They're not here to say no any longer. I'm doing that. Silence pulled at the room until it felt like skin too tight across bone. We're not asking for 26 million, my mother said, softly, almost tender, as if we were friends at a coffee shop. Just help. We're drowning. The house. The car. Your father's back hurts. He needs a surgery. We've given our lives to you kids. We have. You gave your lives to your lives, I said. Which is exactly what you were supposed to do. Don't be cruel, she said, and I thought of the night on the porch, her tears when we asked her to leave because my daughter was crying, and felt my chest turn into a hard, flat plate, like a shield. Sarah slid copies of the letter from my grandparents across the table. I encourage you to read these later, she said. It clarifies intent. It clarifies what Frank and Lillian experienced as they helped you over the years. It clarifies their desire for their gift to Claire. My father looked at the first page. He didn't touch it. My mother's eyes darted across the first lines as if she could rewrite them as she went. They were old, she said. How do you know they were in their right mind? Because there are medical records from their last checkups indicating excellent mental clarity, Sarah said, still calm. Because the trust was established years ago with modifications that reflect a consistent intention. Because there are witnesses. And because, frankly, this is not surprising to the people in their life. My father bristled. What people? The ones who watched you ask, Sarah said. And the ones who watched them say yes and then stop. It was not quite the reveal I had imagined, a flourish and a gasp. It was smaller and meaner. My mother's mouth thinned. My father's face closed like a door. My father has a letter, too, I said, surprising even myself with the heat in my voice. I meant my grandfather. He'd written me a shorter note, tucked into the same envelope. Dear Bear, he wrote. I don't think there is a way to win this that feels like winning. Do it anyway. Trust the quiet people. They are the ones who know what to do when the dust settles. I have logs of the calls, Sarah said, as if we were reading from a script we both already knew. I have screenshots of texts. I have security footage from the doorbell camera the night you came to the house and pounded on the door. I have witness statements from the neighbors, if necessary. We were worried, my mother said, her voice breaking on the word in that way that gets you out of a ticket. Avery was sick. And that is exactly why you should have stayed home, I said. Mom. Dad. I'm asking you to stop. The smallest voice in the room came from me, the youngest part of me, the one that still wanted to lean into my mother's shoulder and smell the laundry soap she always bought on sale. I closed my eyes and pushed down on that voice gently, a calming palm. My father looked at Sarah and Mr. Dunn and said, "To no one, we're going to court. This is a money grab and you're all in on it." Mr. Dunn looked at him with pity I wouldn't want to see on anyone's face. "Rick," he said, "there is no money grab. This is what your parents chose. They had 2 children," my mother said. "How do you not see how obscene this looks?" "They had 2 children," I said, "and 1 granddaughter who lived with them and drove them to every appointment and slept in a chair by their bed in the hospital. They made a choice. That's what people do when they die. They make choices, and those choices matter." My father stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. For a second, his blazer looked like it was full of someone else's shoulders. "We'll see you there," he said. "You'll be sorry." My mother followed him out and then turned back at the door. "I hope Avery sleeps tonight," she said, a curse disguised as concern. It took me a second to breathe, like air was something you could just take. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "You did that," she said. "You did it right. Is this what right feels like?" I asked, a little dazed. "Because it feels like I'll be sick in a minute." "I know," she said. "But the grounds are laid. If they file, we're ready." They filed 3 weeks later. Of course they did. The petition alleged undue influence and lack of capacity. It was a school play with too many actors and not enough rehearsal. My parents' lawyer, a man who had been fired from a big firm in Columbus and moved back to Briarwood to practice out of a converted house with a red door, submitted a glossy cover page with italicized words. They painted a picture of me that I didn't recognize, an opportunist, a manipulator who had isolated aging grandparents and cut their children off. They said I had taken advantage of grief. They said I had refused care when my parents offered it. Sarah read the petition like it was a novel with a two-part twist ending. She wrote in the margins with a mechanical pencil, then called Mr. Dunn for the backup that you only have if you'd planned for this year's back. The trust documents were in order. My grandparents had 2 witnesses in their doctor's office attesting to capacity on the days they amended anything. There was a no contest clause, which mattered more for theoretical drama than practical outcomes, since my parents were not named. There were letters, like the ones in my folder, one from my grandmother simply titled "Why Not," which made me laugh so hard I had to put my head down on Sarah's desk. We scheduled depositions. I sat in a beige room that smelled like wet carpet and told the story of my grandparents in a voice that made me feel like a witness to my own life. My parents sat across with their lawyer, their faces made small by the angle of the lights. They learned, in real time, about the scholarship fund my grandparents had earmarked in their notes for kids from Briarwood going into nursing. They learned about the clause that allowed me to use the funds, if I chose, to endow a wing of the library, and about their notes on the back that said, "or the hospital. If she wants. If it helps." Between that and life, Avery's chemotherapy marched on. At Nationwide, when the port had to be accessed, she whispered, 5 deep breaths, Mommy, and we took them together, our hands linked the way you tie boats together at the dock. The nurses on the 4th floor learned her favorite sticker, whales with hats. I learned to order DoorDash before 7 p.m. because everything near the hospital shut early. At home, I started cooking elaborate recipes at 10 at night, chopping mushrooms into tiny, merciless pieces as if small enough food could slip past fate unnoticed. Noah sat at the counter and told me made-up stories about an ant who wanted to see the top of a mountain, and somehow, we both cried about an ant that was fine, completely fine, because it was easier than crying about the thing that wasn't. My parents wore out their lawyer and hired another one with a similar website. The community took sides in that slow, gentle Briarwood way. At the grocery store, I noticed people looking away or looking too hard. Mrs. O'Hara from my high school English class stopped me near the yogurts and said she had always known my heart was good, which made me want to lie down on the floor between the Greek and the Go-Gurt and sleep there until winter was over. The hearing finally came. Judge Lawson had a face that looked like it had never smiled and then had, once, when his child said something about a frog. He listened to testimony for 2 days. He asked a question that made my mother blink and adjust her pearls, Mrs. Morgan, can you point to any document that suggests Frank and Lillian were not competent when they executed their estate planning documents? She flailed for a moment and then said, "They were very old." "That is not a document," he said, and I loved him a little for it, and then felt the prick of guilty affection. "Your enemies are not always your enemies," my grandmother wrote once in a notebook she used for recipes and opinions. "Sometimes they are just people who cannot walk onto the same floor you're standing on. That doesn't make your floor imaginary." Sarah closed with 8 sentences that sounded like a promise. She talked about intention, about the resilience of a line drawn by people who had saved and planned and given. She did not mention that I was a mother to a child who was helped by the hospital my grandparents had hoped to help. She didn't need to. It hung there anyway, like a thing that had required kindness to build itself. Judgment came quietly, a week later. The court dismissed the petition. The judge called it without merit and fractious. He wrote one line that Sarah emailed to me with a string of exclamation marks I could hear even though she had not typed them. "The court declines to disturb the clearly articulated and repeatedly affirmed intent of Frank and Lillian Morgan." I read it 3 times and then sat in my car in the parking lot of Nationwide Children's and cried so hard I couldn't see. I put my forehead to the steering wheel and felt every muscle in my body let go its habit of holding sky. A volunteer pushing a cart of paperbacks tapped on the window, alarmed. I rolled it down and said, it's okay," and she handed me a book of essays without speaking. Noah and Avery came out of the clinic 20 minutes later, Avery with a popsicle in her mouth and a whale sticker on her shirt. "Why are you wet?" Avery said, matter of fact. "Because I'm alive," I said, and she nodded like she knew. My parents' last move was public. They went on Facebook and told a story that would have made sense if stories were only about feelings and not also about facts. They said I had shut them out. They said I was a gold digger, which was funny if you could find it funny. They said my grandparents had been manipulated. I posted nothing. Sarah made me promise I wouldn't. Mr. Dunn sent a letter reminding them that their petition had been dismissed and that further harassment would result in a different kind of action. Noah sat with me at my kitchen table, my grandmother's table, and taught me how to mute people I loved. "Do you think they'll stop?" I asked. "I think they'll run out of immediate moves," he said. "I don't know if they'll stop. But I think you can live in the quiet anyway." Sometimes the quiet was loud, like the absence of a sound you only notice because it is missing. Sometimes it was exactly what it said it would be. I made appointments I had been putting off. With a therapist named Aria who had a soothing voice and a blunt way with bullies. With a financial advisor who helped me set up a nonprofit foundation with a name that made my hands shake the first time I wrote it, the Frank and Lillian Fund. With a social worker at the hospital who showed me a room that smelled like 3 things: crayons, hand sanitizer, and hope. "An art therapy studio," she said, gesturing. "We've been trying to get the funding forever." I had Avery's hand in mine, small and firm. "What if we pay for it?" I said, and I didn't mean out of guilt or show. I meant because it felt like the thing you do when someone hands you a boulder and asks you to hold it, and you look around and realize there are other people holding rocks next to you. We built it in a year. The walls were pale yellow. There were low tables and a shelf full of everything that makes a mess worth making: paint, glue, glitter contained responsibly in bottles that squirted out in fat dots. Avery painted a whale wearing a hat, of course, and the hat was a crown that said Tuesday, because she liked the word and liked the day. The ribbon cutting was small. Mr. Dunn came with his tie crooked. Sarah brought her daughter, who made a mess and apologized and was told, "There is nothing to apologize for in this room." Noah smiled from the back and I smiled back, and the 2 smiles were like a bridge thrown between us, not romantic, not utilitarian, but something that makes sense by just existing. I invited my parents, a last, small mercy or maybe an experiment I needed to see through. They did not come. I don't know if they were busy or if not showing up felt to them like power. We put my grandparents' names on a bronze plaque next to the doorway. I ran my fingers over the letters until the tips warmed. Something about the way metal remembers heat felt like permission. Time went on the way time does, in lurches and lulls. The line I drew didn't stop the memories from looping. Half the time, I heard my mother's laugh behind me in the grocery store and turned with my heart in my throat. Half the time, I heard nothing and felt relief so strong it made me want to sleep where I stood. Avery lost her hair. It came back in a fuzz that made her look like a baby chick. She wore a cape to chemo one day because she said she needed it, and the nurses made her a crown out of a piece of cardboard from the back of a box of masks. She kept all of these in a bin under her bed, a tidy box of things you can put on to feel braver. I used some of the money for me in ways that felt both necessary and small. I replaced the roof at the house on Hargrove Street. I bought a car that didn't die in winter. I hired a contractor to fix the steps that had creaked under my grandparents' feet for 30 years. I allowed myself one frivolous purchase, a Dutch oven that was the color of a sky just before rain. It wasn't lavish. It was good enough. Kyle called sometimes, his voice tinny from whatever anonymous rental he was living in this month. He apologized for Mom and Dad and then didn't, because some apologies are not ours to make. He sent Avery a book about whales and wrote in the inscription, "To my brave niece. See you soon." He didn't come, and I didn't hold it against him, because we come from the same place and we learn the same things, and unlearning takes time and sometimes a map neither of us has. A year after the ribbon cutting, Avery finished her protocol. We rang the bell at Nationwide, the one that makes your arms ache with the relief of it. Other parents cried with us, that specific cry that is both ugly and holy in its own way, not spiritual but human, the kind that says we made it across this thing together even if across is temporary and never what you think it will be. I wanted to drive to my mother's house and put my forehead against her front door and tell her the story of my daughter ringing a bell. I wanted her hands to pat my hair and for everything to fold back into the easy parts of how it is supposed to be. But the good things are never owed. They are gifts. And I had to sit in my car outside the grocery store with my forehead pressed against the cool of the steering wheel and call Aria, who told me to breathe and to look around. "Name 5 blue things," she said. I did. The sky. The sign for Jefferson Elementary. The nurse's mural on the side of the brick building with the whales. Avery's backpack. Noah's shirt. Sometimes the strategies sound like you're playing a game. It turns out it still helps. I heard from my parents twice. The first was a letter from my father that used words like betrayal and blood and legacy. I put it in the folder on the counter because that's what you do with receipts. The second was a text from my mother that said, simply, "I saw the article in the Gazette about the art room. You didn't have to brag." I deleted it not because I was magnanimous, but because sometimes the only power is refusing to hold ugly things in your hands. Still, there were nights I woke to the worry that their absence meant something about me, not them. I made lists. I wrote letters to my grandparents that started with "Dear Bear," the way my grandfather had called me, and told them small things. Avery said pasta tastes like pianos sometimes. Noah fixed the leaky faucet with a YouTube video. I made jam that tasted more like August than June, but no one complained. When the foundation gave its first scholarships to 3 nursing students from Briarwood High, I watched their parents hug them and remembered the kind of hug that doesn't come with barbed wire. I stood on the small stage in the library and spoke about my grandparents in a voice that did not shake. I said they had a way of making everything feel both practical and extraordinary, like folding laundry could be a promise, like putting one foot on a stair could be a proclamation. I sipped from a paper cup of lukewarm coffee and didn't mind. Avery came up after and slid her hand into mine. "You talked good," she said, deadpan. "You didn't do your shaky voice thing." "I know," I said. "I'm getting better." "Me too," she said, and tilted her chin in that way she has when she has earned her own applause. She had. We both had. I got a voicemail from my father I didn't listen to for a week. When I finally did, he sounded tired and older than he is. He apologized for the porch. He didn't apologize for the lawsuit or the texts. He said he missed Avery and wanted to see her. He said, "Your mother is not herself," which is a thing he says when he wants to shift blame onto a cloud. I called Sarah and told her what he had said. She told me I didn't owe them my child. "But if you want to try something," she said, "we can make it specific and small. Supervised. Short. No money talk." I thought about it for 3 days. I walked the loop around the pond at Columbus Park, the late afternoon light slanting through the willow branches. I stood on the inlet bridge where kids throw sticks in water and watched a turtle bump up and then disappear, the slick of its shell like a wet laugh. I texted my father and said, "You and Mom can come to the art room this Saturday at 10 for 30 minutes. No discussions about money or court or anything beyond art. If it goes well, we can talk about another visit. If you bring anything or anyone without checking with me, it won't happen again." He never responded. Saturday came. The art room smelled like tempura and clean hands. Avery wore a shirt she could ruin and gel pens in her back pocket because she likes the weight of ink. The 30 minutes ticked by in quiet, measured by kids splattering paint. Noah sat on a stool and tapped his foot. I told myself 5 blue things to keep my heart steady. They did not come. It's not rejection when it saves you. It's just clarity. Ari from the hospital brought me a coffee and squeezed my shoulder. "Sometimes the best we can do is say we tried," she said. "And sometimes the best thing we can do is not try again for a while." I nodded so hard my head hurt. Later, in the car, Avery said, in that way that turns everything into fact, "They didn't come," and I said, "No," and we turned the radio up to a song about a horse without symbolism, just a horse, and sang along. We drove past my grandparents' house, the porch now new and not new at all, the lemon oil smell replaced by paint, the hydrangeas rounded into bushes like little clouds left on the ground. I parked and told Avery the story of how her great-grandfather taught me to make a grilled cheese with mayonnaise instead of butter, and how I thought he was out of his mind, and then how it was perfect, in the way that something small can be perfect and matter forever. We went home. The house was the same house it had been when the doorbell rang at 2 in the morning, when we painted the art room, when the judge wrote, without merit. It was also a different house, because I had put the quiet back into it and called it a room. What I learned is that family is not a contract written on the back of a bill. It is a room you build, and sometimes the only people in the room are the ones who know how to sit in it without rearranging the chairs. It is all the small choices that add up to one big line. "No, I won't set myself on fire to keep you warm." I learned that money is gas poured on whatever is already burning. It is not neutral. It finds the cracks and feeds them. The only way to aim it at something worth making is to hold your hands steady and listen for the sound your life makes when it aligns with your values. It's quieter than you think. I learned that the smallest voices tell the most truth. Avery, with a lemon drop in her cheek, whispering 5 breaths, did more to reorganize my spine than any threat or court order could do. She taught me to notch my days by her bravery, not by my fear. My parents are out there in Briarwood, a town that forgives slow and forgets slower. I don't wish them harm. That's not a virtue. It's a boundary. The door is not shut. It is just locked, and the key is a way of behaving that doesn't require me to shatter to let them in. There are nights I stand in the art room alone and count the chairs. There are mornings I stir oatmeal in my Dutch oven and think about my grandmother's handwriting. There is a particular evening light that lands on the porch swing and makes the air look like you could scoop it up with your hand. Somewhere in this town, a kid will drag glitter across a page and call it a whale wearing a crown that says Tuesday. Somewhere else, a judge will write something in a sentence that will be read by a person who needs it. In my house, Avery sleeps with a cap pulled low on her downy head and one hand open, like she might catch something if it falls. I pull the blanket up to her chin and turn out the light and stand in the doorway, my hand on the frame, the wood worn down by decades of people who needed to lean. In the quiet, I hear everything we made room for. Author's note: if you're navigating grief, complicated family dynamics, or legal stress, consider reaching out to resources like local legal aid society chapters for civil protection orders and estate questions, the Cancer Support Community for caregiver groups, and the National Association for Family Therapy to find a licensed therapist in your area. If you need a starting point, many hospitals have oncology social workers who can connect you to support. If stories like this help you feel less alone, consider following and sharing it with someone who might need it.